Katina. Some brief notes about the last days of RAF fighters in the First Greek Campaign**. Peter saw her first. She was sitting on a stone, quite still, with her hands resting on her lap. She was staring vacantly ahead, seeing nothing, and all around, up and down the little street, people were running backward and forward with buckets of water, emptying them through the windows of the burning houses. Across the street on the cobblestones, there was a dead boy. Someone had moved his body close into the side so that it would not be in the way. A little farther down an old man was working on a pile of stones and rubble. One by one he was carrying the stones away and dumping them to the side. Sometimes he would bend down and peer into the ruins, repeating a name over and over again. All around there was shouting and running and fires and buckets of water and dust. And the girl sat quietly on the stone, staring ahead, not moving. There was blood running down the left side of her face. It ran down from her forehead and dropped from her chin onto the dirty print dress she was wearing. Peter saw her and said, "Look at that little girl." We went up to her and Finn put his hand on her shoulder, bending down to examine the cut. "Looks like a piece of shrapnel," he said. "She ought to see the document." Peter and I made a chair with our hands and Finn lifted her up onto it. We started back through the streets now towards the aerodrome, the two of us walking a little awkwardly, bending down, facing our burden. I could feel Peter's fingers clasping tightly in mine and I could feel the buttocks of the little girl resting lightly on my wrists. I was on the left side and the blood was dripping down from her face onto the arm of my flying suit, running down the waterproof cloth onto the back of my hand. The girl never moved or said anything. Finn said, "She's bleeding rather fast. We'd better walk a bit quicker." I couldn't see much of her face because of the blood, but I could tell that she was lovely. She had high cheekbones and large round eyes, pale blue like an autumn sky, and her hair was short and fair. I guessed she was about 9 years old. This was in Greece in early April, 1941, at Paramythia. Our fighter squadron was stationed on a muddy field near the village. We were in a deep valley and all around us were the mountains. The freezing winter had passed, and now, almost before anyone knew it, spring had come. It had come quietly and swiftly, melting the ice on the lakes and brushing the snow off the mountain tops, and all over the airfield we could see the pale green shoots of grass pushing up through the mud, making a carpet for our landings. In our valley there were warm winds and wild flowers. The Germans, who had pushed in through Yugoslavia a few days before, were now operating in force, and that afternoon they had come over very high with about 35 Dorniers and bombed the village. Peter and Finn and I were off duty for a while, and the three of us had gone down to see if there was anything we could do in the way of rescue work. We had spent a few hours digging around in the ruins and helping to put out fires, and we were on our way back when we saw the girl. Now, as we approached the landing field, we could see the hurricanes circling around coming into land, and there was the doc standing out in front of the dispersal tent, just as he should have been, waiting to see if anyone had been hurt. We walked towards him, carrying the child, and Finn, who was a few yards in front, said, "Doc, you lazy old devil, here's a job for you." The doc was young and kind and morose except when he got drunk. When he got drunk he sang very well. "Take her into the sick bay," he said. Peter and I carried her in and put her down on a chair. Then we left her and wandered over to the dispersal tent to see how the boys had got along. It was beginning to get dark. There was a sunset behind the ridge over in the west, and there was a full moon, a bomber's moon, climbing up into the sky. The moon shone upon the shoulders of the tents and made them white, small white pyramids, standing up straight, clustering in little orderly groups around the edges of the aerodrome. They had a scared sheep look about them the way they clustered themselves together, and they had a human look about them the way they stood up close to one another, and it seemed almost as though they knew that there was going to be trouble, as though someone had warned them that they might be forgotten and left behind. Even as I looked, I thought I saw them move. I thought I saw them huddled just a fraction nearer together. And then, silently, without a sound, the mountains crept a little closer into our valley. For the next 2 days there was much flying. There was the getting up at dawn, there was the flying, the fighting and the sleeping, and there was the retreat of the army. That was about all there was or all there was time for. But on the 3rd day the clouds dropped down over the mountains and slid into the valley. And it rained. So we sat around in the mess tent drinking beer and resinado, while the rain made a noise like a sewing machine on the roof. Then lunch. For the first time in days the whole squadron was present. 15 pilots at a long table with benches on either side and Monkey, the CO, sitting at the head. We were still in the middle of our fried corned beef when the flap of the tent opened and in came the doc with an enormous dripping raincoat over his head. And with him, under the coat, was the little girl. She had a bandage round her head. The doc said, "Hello. I've brought a guest." We looked around and suddenly, automatically, we all stood up. The doc was taking off his raincoat and the little girl was standing there with her hands hanging loose by her sides looking at the men, and the men were all looking at her. With her fair hair and pale skin she looked less like a Greek than anyone I've ever seen. She was frightened by the 15 scruffy-looking foreigners who had suddenly stood up when she came in, and for a moment she half-turned as if she were going to run away out into the rain. Monkey said, "Hello. Hello there. Come and sit down. Talk Greek," the doc said. "She doesn't understand." Finn and Peter and I looked at one another and Finn said, "Good God, it's our little girl. Nice work, document." She recognized Finn and walked round to where he was standing. He took her by the hand and sat her down on the bench, and everyone else sat down too. We gave her some fried corned beef and she ate it slowly, looking down at her plate while she ate. Monkey said, "Get Pericles." Pericles was the Greek interpreter attached to the squadron. He was a wonderful man we'd picked up at Yenina, where he had been the local school teacher. He had been out of work ever since the war started. "The children do not come to school," he said. "They are up in the mountains and fight. I cannot teach sums to the stones." Pericles came in. He was old, with a beard, a long pointed nose and sad gray eyes. You couldn't see his mouth, but his beard had a way of smiling when he talked. "Ask her her name," said Monkey. He said something to her in Greek. She looked up and said, "Katina." That was all she said. "Look, Pericles," Peter said, "ask her what she was doing sitting by that heap of ruins in the village." Finn said, "For God's sake leave her alone." "Ask her, Pericles," said Peter. "What should I ask?" said Pericles, frowning. Peter said, what she was doing sitting on that heap of stuff in the village when we found her. Pericles sat down on the bench beside her and he talked to her again. He spoke gently and you could see that his beard was smiling a little as he spoke, helping her. She listened and it seemed a long time before she answered. When she spoke, it was only a few words, and the old man translated. She says that her family were under the stones. Outside the rain was coming down harder than ever. It beat upon the roof of the mess tent so that the canvas shivered as the water bounced upon it. I got up and walked over and lifted the flap of the tent. The mountains were invisible behind the rain, but I knew they were around us on every side. I had a feeling that they were laughing at us, laughing at the smallness of our numbers and at the hopeless courage of the pilots. I felt that it was the mountains, not us, who were the clever ones. Had not the hills that very morning turned and looked northward towards Tepelin where they had seen 1,000 German aircraft gathered under the shadow of Olympus? Was it not true that the snow on the top of Dodona had melted away in a day, sending little rivers of water running down across our landing field? Had not Katafidi buried his head in a cloud so that our pilots might be tempted to fly through the whiteness and crash against his rugged shoulders? And as I stood there looking at the rain through the tent flap, I knew for certain that the mountains had turned against us. I could feel it in my stomach. I went back into the tent and there was Finn, sitting beside Katina, trying to teach her English words. I don't know whether he made much progress, but I do know that once he made her laugh and that was a wonderful thing for him to have done. I remember the sudden sound of her high laughter and how we all looked up and saw her face, how we saw how different it was to what it had been before. No one but Finn could have done it. He was so gay himself that it was difficult to be serious in his presence. He was gay and tall and black-haired, and he was sitting there on the bench, leaning forward, whispering and smiling, teaching Katina to speak English and teaching her how to laugh. The next day the skies cleared and once again we saw the mountains. We did a patrol over the troops which were already retreating slowly towards Thermopylae, and we met some Messerschmitts and Ju-87s dive-bombing the soldiers. I think we got a few of them, but they got Sandy. I saw him going down. I sat quite still for 30 seconds and watched his plane spiraling gently downward. I sat and waited for the parachute. I remember switching over my radio and saying quietly, "Sandy, you must jump now. You must jump, you're getting near the ground." But there was no parachute. When we landed and taxied and there was Katina, standing outside the dispersal tent with the doc, a tiny shrimp of a girl in a dirty print dress, standing there watching the machines as they came in to land. To Finn, as he walked in, she said, "The Juris is Sana." Finn said, "What does it mean, Pericles?" "It just means, you are back again," and he smiled. The child had counted the aircraft on her fingers as they took off, and now she noticed that there was one missing. We were standing around taking off our parachutes and she was trying to ask us about it, when suddenly someone said, "Look out. Here they come." They came through a gap in the hills, a mass of thin, black silhouettes, coming down upon the aerodrome. There was a scramble for the slit trenches and I remember seeing Finn catch Katina round the waist and carry her off with us, and I remember seeing her fight like a tiger the whole way to the trenches. As soon as we got into the trench and Finn had let her go, she jumped out and ran over onto the airfield. Down came the Messerschmitts with their guns blazing, swooping so low that you could see the noses of the pilots sticking out under their goggles. Their bullets threw up spurts of dust all around, and I saw one of our Hurricanes burst into flames. I saw Katina standing right in the middle of the field, standing firmly with her legs astride and her back to us, looking up at the Germans as they dived past. I have never seen anything smaller and more angry and more fierce in my life. She seemed to be shouting at them, but the noise was great and one could hear nothing at all except the engines and the guns of the aeroplanes. Then it was over. It was over as quickly as it had begun, and no one said very much except Finn, who said, "I wouldn't have done that, ever, not even if I was crazy." That evening Monkey got out the squadron records and added Katina's name to the list of members, and the equipment officer was ordered to provide a tent for her. So, on the 11th of April, 1941, she became a member of the squadron. In 2 days she knew the first name or nickname of every pilot, and Finn had already taught her to say, "Any luck," and "Nice work." But that was a time of much activity, and when I try to think of it hour by hour, the whole period becomes hazy in my mind. Mostly, I remember, it was escorting the Blenheims to Valona, and if it wasn't that, it was a ground strafe of Italian trucks on the Albanian border or an SOS from the Northumberland Regiment saying they were having the hell bombed out of them by half the aircraft in Europe. None of that can I remember. I can remember nothing of that time clearly, save for 2 things. The one was Katina and how she was with us all the time, how she was everywhere and how wherever she went the people were pleased to see her. The other thing that I remember was when the bull came into the mess tent one evening after a lone patrol. The bull was an enormous man with massive, slightly hunched shoulders, and his chest was like the top of an oak table. Before the war he had done many things, most of them things which one could not do unless one conceded beforehand that there was no difference between life and death. He was quiet and casual, and when he came into a room or into a tent, he always looked as though he had made a mistake and hadn't really meant to come in at all. It was getting dark and we were sitting round in the tent playing shove halfpenny when the bull came in. We KM'd that he had just landed. He glanced around a little apologetically, then he said, "Hello," and wandered over to the bar and began to get out a bottle of beer. Someone said, "See anything, bull?" The bull said, "Yes," and went on fiddling with the bottle of beer. I suppose we were all very interested in our game of shove halfpenny because no one said anything else for about 5 minutes. Then Peter said, "What did you see, bull?" The bull was leaning against the bar, alternately sipping his beer and trying to make a hooting noise by blowing down the neck of the empty bottle. Peter said, "What did you see?" The bull put down the bottle and looked up. 5 S-79s, he said. I remember hearing him say it, but I remember also that our game was exciting and that Finn had one more shove to win. We all watched him miss it, and Peter said, "Finn, I think you're going to lose." And Finn said, "Go to hell." We finished the game, then I looked up and saw the bull still leaning against the bar making noises with his beer bottle. He said, "This sounds like the old Mauritania coming into New York Harbor," and he started blowing into the bottle again. "What happened with the S-79s?" I said. He stopped his blowing and put down the bottle. "I shot them down." Everyone heard it. At that moment 11 pilots in that tent stopped what they were doing and 11 heads flicked around and looked at the bull. He took another drink of his beer and said quietly, "At one time I counted 18 parachutes in the air together." A few days later he went on patrol and did not come back. Shortly afterwards Monkey got a message from Athens. It said that the squadron was to move down to Eleusis and from there do a defense of Athens itself and also cover the troops retreating through the Thermopylae Pass. Katina was to go with the trucks and we told the doc he was to see that she arrived safely. It would take them a day to make the journey. We flew over the mountains towards the south, 14 of us, and at 2:30 we landed at Eleusis. It was a lovely aerodrome with runways and hangars, and best of all, Athens was only 25 minutes away by car. That evening, as it was getting dark, I stood outside my tent. I stood with my hands in my pockets watching the sun go down and thinking of the work which we were to do. The more that I thought of it, the more impossible I knew it to be. I looked up, and once again I saw the mountains. They were closer to us here, crowding in upon us on all sides, standing shoulder to shoulder, tall and naked, with their heads in the clouds, surrounding us everywhere save in the south, where lay Piraeus and the open sea. I knew that each night, when it was very dark, when we were all tired and sleeping in our tents, those mountains would move forward, creeping a little closer, making no noise, until at last on the appointed day they would tumble forward with one great rush and push us into the sea. Finn emerged from his tent. "Have you seen the mountains?" I said. "They're full of gods." "They aren't any good," he answered. "I wish they'd stand still," I said. Finn looked up at the great crags of Panes and Pentelicon. "They're full of gods," he said. "Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when there is a moon, you can see the gods sitting on the summits. There was one on Catophody when we were at Paramythia. He was huge, like a house, but without any shape and quite black." "You saw him?" "Of course I saw him." "When?" I said. "When did you see him, Finn?" Finn said, "Let's go into Athens. Let's go and look at the women in Athens." The next day the trucks carrying the ground staff and the equipment rumbled onto the aerodrome, and there was Katina sitting in the front seat of the leading vehicle with the doc beside her. She waved to us as she jumped down, and she came running towards us, laughing and calling our names in a curious Greek way. She still had on the same dirty print dress and she still had a bandage round her forehead, but the sun was shining in her hair. We showed her the tent which we had prepared for her, and we showed her the small cotton nightdress which Finn had obtained in some mysterious way the night before in Athens. It was white with a lot of little blue birds embroidered on the front, and we all thought that it was very beautiful. Katina wanted to put it on at once, and it took a long time to persuade her that it was meant only for sleeping in. 6 times Finn had to perform a complicated act which consisted of pretending to put on the nightdress, then jumping onto the bed and falling fast asleep. In the end she nodded vigorously and understood. For the next 2 days nothing happened, except that the remnants of another squadron came down from the north and joined us. They brought 6 Hurricanes, so that altogether we had about 20 machines. Then we waited. On the 3rd day German reconnaissance aircraft appeared, circling high over Piraeus, and we chased after them but never got up in time to catch them. This was understandable, because our radar was of a very special type. It is obsolete now, and I doubt whether it will ever be used again. All over the country, in all the villages, up on the mountains and out on the islands, there were Greeks, all of whom were connected to our small operations room by field telephone. We had no operations officer, so we took it in turns to be on duty for the day. My turn came on the fourth day, and I remember clearly what happened. At 6:30 in the morning the phone buzzed. "This is 7, said a very Greek voice. "This is 7. There are noises overhead." I looked at the map. There was a little ring with a 7-foot written inside it just beside Yanina. I put a cross on the celluloid which covered the map and wrote noises beside it, as well as the time, 0631 hours. 3 minutes later the phone went again. "This is A4. This is A4. There are many noises above me," said an old quavering voice, "but I cannot see because there are thick clouds." I looked at the map. A4 was in the Karava. I made another cross on the celluloid and wrote many noises 0634, and then I drew a line between Yanina and Karava. It pointed towards Athens, so I signaled the readiness crew to scramble, and they took off and circled the city. Later they saw a Ju-88 on reconnaissance high above them, but they never caught it. It was in such a way that one worked the radar. That evening when I came off duty I could not help thinking of the old Greek, sitting all alone in a hut up at A4, sitting on the slope of Karava looking up into the whiteness and listening all day and all night for noises in the sky. I imagined the eagerness with which he seized the telephone when he heard something, and the joy he must have felt when the voice at the other end repeated his message and thanked him. I thought of his clothes and wondered if they were warm enough, and I thought, for some reason, of his boots, which almost certainly had no soles left upon them and were stuffed with tree bark and paper. That was April 17th. It was the evening when Monkey said, "They say the Germans are at Lamia," which means that we're within range of their fighters. Tomorrow the fun should start. It did. At dawn the bombers came over, with the fighters circling around overhead, watching the bombers, waiting to pounce, but doing nothing unless someone interfered with the bombers. I think we got 8 hurricanes into the air just before they arrived. It was not my turn to go up, so with Katina standing by my side I watched the battle from the ground. The child never said a word. Now and again she moved her head as she followed the little specks of silver dancing high above in the sky. I saw a plane coming down in a trail of black smoke, and I looked at Katina. The hatred which was on the face of the child was the fierce burning hatred of an old woman who has hatred in her heart. It was an old woman's hatred, and it was strange to see it. In that battle we lost a sergeant called Donald. At noon Monkey got another message from Athens. It said that morale was bad in the capital and that every available hurricane was to fly in formation low over the city in order to show the inhabitants how strong we were and how many aircraft we had. 18 of us took off. We flew in tight formation up and down the main streets just above the roofs of the houses. I could see the people looking up, shielding their eyes from the sun, looking at us as we flew over, and in one street I saw an old woman who never looked up at all. None of them waved, and I knew then that they were resigned to their fate. None of them waved, and I knew, although I could not see their faces, that they were not even glad as we flew past. Then we headed out towards Thermopylae, but on the way we circled the Acropolis twice. It was the first time I had seen it so close. I saw a little hill, a mound almost, it seemed, and on the top of it I saw the white columns. There were a great number of them, grouped together in perfect order, not crowding one another, white in the sunshine, and I wondered, as I looked at them, how anyone could have put so much on top of so small a hill in such an elegant way. Then we flew up the great Thermopylae Pass and I saw long lines of vehicles moving slowly southwards towards the sea. I saw occasional puffs of white smoke where a shell landed in the valley, and I saw a direct hit on the road which made a gap in the line of trucks. But we saw no enemy aircraft. When we landed, Monkey said, "Refuel quickly and get in the air again. I think they're waiting to catch us on the ground." But it was no use. They came down out of the sky 5 minutes after we had landed. I remember I was in the pilot's room in number 2 hangar, talking to Finn and to a big tall man with rumpled hair called Paddy. We heard the bullets on the corrugated iron roof of the hangar, then we heard explosions and the 3 of us dived under the little wooden table in the middle of the room, but the table upset. Paddy set it up again and crawled underneath. "There's something about being under a table," he said. "I don't feel safe unless I'm under a table." Finn said, "I never feel safe." He was sitting on the floor watching the bullets making holes in the corrugated iron wall of the room. There was a great clatter as the bullets hit the tin. Then we became brave and got up and peeped outside the door. There were many Messerschmitt 109s circling the aerodrome, and one by one they straightened out and dived past the hangars, spraying the ground with their guns. But they did something else. They slid back their cockpit hoods, and as they came past they threw out small bombs which exploded when they hit the ground and fiercely flung quantities of large lead balls in every direction. Those were the explosions which we had heard, and it was a great noise that the lead balls made as they hit the hangar. Then I saw the men, the ground crews, standing up in their slit trenches firing at the Messerschmitts with rifles, reloading and firing as fast as they could, cursing and shouting as they shot, aiming ludicrously, hopelessly, aiming at an aeroplane with just a rifle. At Alevsis there were no other defenses. Suddenly the Messerschmitts all turned and headed for home, all except one, which glided down and made a smooth belly landing on the aerodrome. Then there was chaos. The Greeks around us raised a shout and jumped onto the fire tender and headed out towards the crashed German aeroplane. At the same time more Greeks streamed out from every corner of the field, shouting and yelling and crying for the blood of the pilot. It was a mob intent upon vengeance and one could not blame them, but there were other considerations. We wanted the pilot for questioning, and we wanted him alive. Monkey, who was standing on the tarmac, shouted to us, and Finn and Paddy and I raced with him towards the station wagon which was standing 50 yards away. Monkey was inside like a flash, started the engine and drove off just as the 3 of us jumped on the running board. The fire tender with the Greeks on it was not fast and it still had 200 yards to go, and the other people had a long way to run. Monkey drove quickly and we beat them by about 50 yards. We jumped up and ran over to the Messerschmitt, and there, sitting in the cockpit, was a fair-haired boy with pink cheeks and blue eyes. I have never seen anyone whose face showed so much fear. He said to Monkey in English, "I am hit in the leg." We pulled him out of the cockpit and got him into the car, while the Greeks stood around watching. The bullet had shattered the bone in his shin. We drove him back, and as we handed him over to the dock, I saw Katina standing close, looking at the face of the German. This kid of 9 was standing there looking at the German, and she could not speak, she could not even move. She clutched the skin of her dress in her hands and stared at the man's face. "There is a mistake somewhere," she seemed to be saying. "There must be a mistake. This one has pink cheeks and fair hair and blue eyes. This cannot possibly be one of them. This is an ordinary boy." She watched him as they put him on a stretcher and carried him off. Then she turned and ran across the grass to her tent. In the evening at supper I ate my fried sardines, but I could not eat the bread or the cheese. For 3 days I had been conscious of my stomach, of a hollow feeling such as one gets just before an operation or while waiting to have a tooth out in the dentist's house. I had had it all day for 3 days, from the moment I woke up to the time I fell asleep. Peter was sitting opposite me and I asked him about it. "I've had it for a week," he said. "It's good for the bowels. It loosens them. German aircraft are like liver pills," said Finn from the bottom of the table. "They are very good for you, aren't they, Doc?" The doc said, "Maybe you've had an overdose." "I have," said Finn. "I've had an overdose of German liver pills. I didn't read the instructions on the bottle. Take 2 before retiring." Peter said, "I would love to retire." After supper 3 of us walked down to the hangars with Monkey, who said, "I'm worried about this ground strafing. They never attack the hangars because they know that we never put anything inside them. Tonight I think we'll collect 4 of the aircraft and put them into number 2 hangar." That was a good idea. Normally the Hurricanes were dispersed all over the edge of the aerodrome, but they were picked off one by one, because it was impossible to be in the air the whole time. The 4 of us took a machine each and taxied it into number 2 hangar, and then we pulled the great sliding doors together and locked them. The next morning, before the sun had risen from behind the mountains, a flock of Ju-87s came over and blew number 2 hangar right off the face of the earth. Their bombing was good and they did not even hit the hangars on either side of it. That afternoon they got Peter. He went off towards a village called Kalkis, which was being bombed by Ju-88s, and no one ever saw him again. Gay, laughing Peter, whose mother lived on a farm in Kent and who used to write to him in long, pale blue envelopes which he carried about in his pockets. I had always shared a tent with Peter, ever since I came to the squadron, and that evening after I had gone to bed he came back to that tent. You need not believe me, I do not expect you to, but I am telling you what happened. I always went to bed first, because there is not room in one of those tents for 2 people to be turning around at the same time. Peter usually came in 2 or 3 minutes afterwards. That evening I went to bed and I lay thinking that tonight he would not be coming. I wondered whether his body lay tangled in the wreckage of his aircraft on the side of some bleak mountain or whether it was at the bottom of the sea, and I hoped only that he had had a decent funeral. Suddenly I heard a movement. The flap of the tent opened and it shut again. But there were no footsteps. Then I heard him sit down on his bed. It was a noise that I had heard every night for weeks past, and always it had been the same. It was just a thump and a creaking of the wooden legs of the camp bed. One after the other the flying boots were pulled off and dropped upon the ground, and as always one of them took 3 times as long to get off as the other. After that there was the gentle rustle of a blanket being pulled back, and then the creakings of the rickety bed as it took the weight of a man's body. They were sounds I had heard every night, the same sounds in the same order, and now I sat up in bed and said, "Peter." It was dark in the tent. My voice sounded very loud. "Hello, Peter. That was tough luck you had today." But there was no answer. I did not feel uneasy or frightened, but I remember at the time touching the tip of my nose with my finger to make sure that I was there. Then, because I was very tired, I went to sleep. In the morning I looked at the bed and saw it had been slept in. But I did not show it to anyone, not even to Finn. I put the blankets back in place myself and patted the pillow. It was on that day, the 20th of April, 1941, that we fought the Battle of Athens. It was perhaps the last of the great dogfighting air battles that will ever be fought, because nowadays the planes fly always in great formation of wings and squadrons, and attack is carried out methodically and scientifically upon the orders of the leader. Nowadays one does not dogfight at all over the sky except upon very rare occasions. But the Battle of Athens was a long and beautiful dogfight in which 15 Hurricanes fought for half an hour with between 150 and 200 German bombers and fighters. The bombers started coming over early in the afternoon. It was a lovely spring day, and for the first time the sun had in it a trace of real summer warmth. The sky was blue, save for a few wispy clouds here and there, and the mountains stood out black and clear against the blue of the sky. Pentelicon no longer hid his head in the clouds. He stood over us, grim and forbidding, watching every move and knowing that each thing we did was of little purpose. Men were foolish and were made only so that they should die, while mountains and rivers went on forever and did not notice the passing of time. Had not Pentelicon himself many years ago looked down upon Thermopylae and seen a handful of Spartans defending the pass against the invaders, seen them fight until there was not one man left alive among them? Had he not seen the Persians cut to pieces by Leonidas at Marathon, and had he not looked down upon Salamis and upon the sea when Themistocles and the Athenians drove the enemy from their shores, causing them to lose more than 200 sails? All these things and many more he had seen, and now he looked down upon us. We were as nothing in his eyes. Almost there was a look of scorn upon the face of the mountain, and I thought for a moment that I could hear the laughter of the gods. They knew so well that we were not enough and that in the end we must lose. The bombers came over just after lunch, and at once we saw that there were a great number of them. We looked up and saw that the sky was full of little silver specks, and the sunlight danced and sparkled upon 100 different pairs of wings. There were 15 hurricanes in all, and they fought like a storm in the sky. It is not easy to remember much about such a battle, but I remember looking up and seeing in the sky a mass of small black dots. I remember thinking to myself that those could not be aeroplanes. They simply could not be aeroplanes, because there were not so many aeroplanes in the world. Then they were on us, and I remembered that I applied a little flap so that I should be able to turn in tighter circles. Then I remember only one or two small incidents which photographed themselves upon my mind. There were the spurts of flame from the guns of a Messerschmitt as he attacked from the frontal quarter of my starboard side. There was the German whose parachute was on fire as it opened. There was the German who flew up beside me and made rude signs at me with his fingers. There was the hurricane which collided with a Messerschmitt. There was the aeroplane which collided with a man who was descending in a parachute, and which went into a crazy frightful spin towards the earth with the man and the parachute dangling from its port wing. There were the two bombers which collided while swerving to avoid a fighter, and I remember distinctly seeing a man being thrown clear out of the smoke and debris of the collision, hanging in mid-air with his arms outstretched and his legs apart. I tell you, there was nothing that did not happen in that battle. There was the moment when I saw a single hurricane doing tight turns around the summit of Parnes with 9 Messerschmitts on its tail, and then I remember that suddenly the skies seemed to clear. There was no longer any aircraft in sight. The battle was over. I turned around and headed back towards Eleusis, and as I went I looked down and saw Athens and Piraeus and the rim of the sea as it curved around the Gulf and traveled southward towards the Mediterranean. I saw the port of Piraeus where the bombs had fallen, and I saw the smoke and fire rising above the docks. I saw the narrow coastal plain, and on it I saw tiny bonfires, thin columns of black smoke curling upward and drifting away to the east. They were the fires of aircraft which had been shot down, and I hoped only that none of them were hurricanes. Just then I ran straight into a Junkers 88, a straggler, the last bomber returning from the raid. He was in trouble, and there was black smoke streaming from one of his engines. Although I shot at him, I don't think that it made any difference. He was coming down anyway. We were over the sea, and I could tell that he wouldn't make the land. He didn't. He came down smoothly on his belly in the blue Gulf of Piraeus, 2 miles from the shore. I followed him and circled, waiting to make sure that the crew got out safely into their dinghy. Slowly the machine began to sink, dipping its nose under the water and lifting its tail into the air. But there was no sign of the crew. Suddenly, without any warning, the rear gun started to fire. They opened up with their rear gun, and the bullets made small jagged holes in my starboard wing. I swerved away, and I remember shouting at them. I slid back the hood of the cockpit and shouted, "You lousy brave bastards! I hope you drown." The bombers sank soon backwards. When I got back they were all standing around outside the hangars counting the score, and Katina was sitting on a box with tears rolling down her cheeks. But she was not crying, and Finn was kneeling down beside her, talking to her in English, quietly and gently, forgetting that she could not understand. We lost 1/3 of our hurricanes in that battle, but the Germans lost more. The doc was dressing someone who had been burnt, and he looked up and said, "You should have heard the Greeks on the aerodrome cheering as the bombers fell out of the sky." As we stood around talking, a truck drove up and a Greek got out and said that he had some pieces of body inside. "This is the watch," he said, "that was on the arm." It was a silver wrist watch with a luminous dial, and on the back there were some initials. We did not look inside the truck. Now we had, I think, 9 hurricanes left. That evening a very senior RAF officer came out from Athens and said, "Tomorrow at dawn you will all fly to Megara. It is about 10 miles down the coast. There is a small field there on which you can land. The army is working on it throughout the night. They have 2 big rollers there, and they are rolling it smooth. The moment you land you must hide your aircraft in the olive grove which is on the south side of the field. The ground staff are going farther south to Argos, and you can join them later, but you may be able to operate from Megara for a day or 2. Finn said, "Where's Katina?" "Doc, you must find Katina and see that she gets to Argos safely." The doc said, "I will," and we knew that we could trust him. At dawn the next morning, when it was still dark, we took off and flew to the little field at Megara, 10 miles away. We landed and hid our hurricanes in the olive grove and broke off branches of the trees and put them over the aircraft. Then we sat down on the slope of a small hill and waited for orders. As the sun rose up over the mountains, we looked across the field and saw a mass of Greek villagers coming down from the village of Megara, coming down towards our field. There were many hundreds of them, women and children mostly, and they all came down towards our field, hurrying as they came. Finn said, "What the hell?" and we sat up on our little hill and watched, wondering what they were going to do. They dispersed all around the edge of the field and gathered armfuls of heather and bracken. They carried it out onto the field, and forming themselves into long lines, they began to scatter the heather and the bracken over the grass. They were camouflaging our landing field. The rollers, when they had rolled out the ground and made it flat for landing, had left marks which were easily visible from above, and so the Greeks came out of their village, every man, woman and child, and began to put matters right. To this day I do not know who told them to do it. They stretched in a long line across the field, walking forward slowly and scattering the heather, and Finn and I went out and walked among them. They were old women and old men mostly, very small and very sad-looking, with dark, deeply wrinkled faces, and they worked slowly scattering the heather. As we walked by, they would stop their work and smile, saying something in Greek which we could not understand. One of the children gave Finn a small pink flower, and he did not know what to do with it, but walked around carrying it in his hand. Then we went back to the slope of the hill and waited. Soon the field telephone buzzed. It was the very senior officer speaking. He said that someone must fly back to Eleusis at once and collect important messages and money. He said also that all of us must leave our little field at Megara and go to Argos that evening. The others said that they would wait until I came back with the money so that we could all fly to Argos together. At the same time, someone had told the 2 army men who were still rolling our field to destroy their rollers so that the Germans would not get them. I remember, as I was getting into my hurricane, seeing the 2 huge rollers charging towards each other across the field, and I remember seeing the army men jump aside just before they collided. There was a great crash, and I saw all the Greeks who were scattering heather stop in their work and look up. For a moment they stood rock still, looking at the rollers. Then one of them started to run. It was an old woman, and she started to run back to the village as fast as she could, shouting something as she went, and instantly every man, woman, and child in the field seemed to take fright and ran after her. I wanted to get out and run beside them and explain to them, to say I was sorry, but that there was nothing else we could do. I wanted to tell them that we would not forget them and that one day we would come back. But it was no use. Bewildered and frightened, they ran back to their homes, and they did not stop running until they were out of sight, not even the old men. I took off and flew to Eleusis. I landed on a dead aerodrome. There was not a soul to be seen. I parked my hurricane, and as I walked over to the hangars the bombers came over once again. I hid in a ditch until they had finished their work, then got up and walked over to the small operations room. The telephone was still on the table, so for some reason I picked up the receiver and said, "Hello." A rather German voice at the other end answered. I said, "Can you hear me?" and the voice said, Yes, yes, I can hear you. All right, I said, listen carefully. Yes, continue please. This is the RAF speaking. And one day we will come back, do you understand? One day we will come back. Then I tore the telephone from its socket and threw it through the glass of the closed window. When I went outside there was a small man in civilian clothes standing near the door. He had a revolver in one hand and a small bag in the other. Do you want anything? He said in quite good English. I said, yes, I want important messages and papers which I am to carry back to Argos. Here you are, he said, as he handed me the bag. And good luck. I flew back to Megra. There were 2 Greek destroyers standing offshore, burning and sinking. I circled our field and the others taxied out, took off, and we all flew off towards Argos. The landing ground at Argos was just a kind of small field. It was surrounded by thick olive groves into which we taxied our aircraft for hiding. I don't know how long the field was, but it was not easy to land upon it. You had to come in low hanging on the prop, and the moment you touched down you had to start putting on brake, jerking it on and jerking it off again the moment she started to nose over. But only one man overshot and crashed. The ground staff had arrived already, and as we got out of our aircraft Katina came running up with a basket of black olives, offering them to us and pointing to our stomachs, indicating that we must eat. Finn bent down and ruffled her hair with his hand. He said, Katina, one day we must go into town and buy you a new dress. She smiled at him but did not understand, and we all started to eat black olives. Then I looked around and saw that the wood was full of aircraft. Around every corner there was an aeroplane hidden in the trees, and when we asked about it we learned that the Greeks had brought the whole of their air force down to Argos and parked them in that little wood. They were peculiar ancient models, not one of them less than 5 years old, and I don't know how many dozen there were there. That night we slept under the trees. We wrapped Katina up in a large flying suit and gave her a flying helmet for a pillow, and after she had gone to sleep we sat around eating black olives and drinking resinado out of an enormous cask. But we were very tired, and soon we fell asleep. All the next day we saw the truckloads of troops moving down the road towards the sea, and as often as we could we took off and flew above them. The Germans kept coming over and bombing the road nearby, but they had not yet spotted our airfield. Later in the day we were told that every available hurricane was to take off at 6 p.m. to protect an important shipping move, and the 9 machines, which were all that were now left, were refueled and got ready. At 3 minutes to 6 we began to taxi out of the olive grove onto the field. The first 2 machines took off, but just as they left the ground something black swept down out of the sky and shot them both down in flames. I looked around and saw at least 50 Messerschmitt 110 circling our field, and even as I looked some of them turned and came down upon the remaining 7 Hurricanes which were waiting to take off. There was no time to do anything. Each one of our aircraft was hit in that first swoop, although funnily enough only one of the pilots was hurt. It was impossible now to take off, so we jumped out of our aircraft, hauled the wounded pilot out of his cockpit and ran with him back to the slit trenches, to the wonderful big, deep zigzagging slit trenches which had been dug by the Greeks. The Messerschmitts took their time. There was no opposition either from the ground or from the air, except that Finn was firing his revolver. It is not a pleasant thing to be ground-strafed, especially if they have cannon in their wings, and unless one has a deep slit trench in which to lie, there is no future in it. For some reason, perhaps because they thought it was a good joke, the German pilots went for the slit trenches before they bothered about the aircraft. The first 10 minutes was spent rushing madly around the corners of the trenches so as not to be caught in a trench which ran parallel with the line of flight of the attacking aircraft. It was a hectic, dreadful 10 minutes, with everyone shouting, "Here comes another," and scrambling and rushing to get around the corner into the other section of the trench. Then the Germans went for the Hurricanes and at the same time for the mass of old Greek aircraft parked all around the olive grove, and one by one, methodically and systematically, they set them on fire. The noise was terrific, and everywhere in the trees, on the rocks and on the grass the bullets splattered. I remember peeping cautiously over the top of our trench and seeing a small white flower growing just a few inches away from my nose. It was pure white and it had 3 petals. I remember looking past it and seeing 3 of the Germans diving on my own Hurricane which was parked on the other side of the field, and I remember shouting at them, although I do not know what I said. Then suddenly I saw Katina. She was running out from the far corner of the aerodrome, running right out into the middle of this mass of blazing guns and burning aircraft, running as fast as she could. Once she stumbled, but she scrambled to her feet again and went on running. Then she stopped and stood looking up, raising her fists at the planes as they flew past. Now as she stood there, I remember seeing one of the Messerschmitts turning and coming in low straight towards her, and I remember thinking that she was so small that she could not be hit. I remember seeing the spurts of flame from his guns as he came, and I remember seeing the child, for a split second, standing quite still, facing the machine. I remember that the wind was blowing in her hair. Then she was down. The next moment I shall never forget. On every side, as if by magic, men appeared out of the ground. They swarmed out of their trenches and like a crazy mob poured onto the aerodrome, running towards the tiny little bundle, which lay motionless in the middle of the field. They ran fast, crouching as they went, and I remember jumping up out of my slit trench and joining with them. I remember thinking of nothing at all and watching the boots of the man in front of me, noticing that he was a little bow-legged and that his blue trousers were much too long. I remember seeing Finn arrive first, followed closely by a sergeant called Wishful, and I remember seeing the 2 of them pick up Katina and start running with her back towards the trenches. I saw her leg, which was just a lot of blood and bones, and I saw her chest where the blood was spurting out onto her white print dress. I saw, for a moment, her face, which was white as the snow on top of Olympus. I ran beside Finn, and as he ran, he kept saying, "The lousy bastards, the lousy, bloody bastards," and then as we got to our trench I remember looking round and finding that there was no longer any noise or shooting. The Germans had gone. Finn said, "Where's the doc?" And suddenly there he was, standing beside us, looking at Katina, looking at her face. The doc gently touched her wrist and without looking up he said, "She is not alive." They put her down under a little tree, and when I turned away I saw on all sides the fires of countless burning aircraft. I saw my own Hurricane burning nearby, and I stood staring hopelessly into the flames as they danced around the engine and licked against the metal of the wings. I stood staring into the flames, and as I stared the fire became a deeper red and I saw beyond it not a tangled mass of smoking wreckage, but the flames of a hotter and intenser fire which now burned and smoldered in the hearts of the people of Greece. Still I stared, and as I stared I saw in the center of the fire, whence the red flames sprang, a bright, white heat, shining bright and without any color. As I stared, the brightness diffused and became soft and yellow like sunlight, and through it, beyond it, I saw a young child standing in the middle of a field with the sunlight shining in her hair. For a moment she stood looking up into the sky, which was clear and blue and without any clouds. Then she turned and looked towards me, and as she turned I saw that the front of her white print dress was stained deep red, the color of blood. Then there was no longer any fire or any flames, and I saw before me only the glowing twisted wreckage of a burned-out plane. I must have been standing there for quite a long time.